Hi, how are you? I'm fine. And you? I'm great. Awesome. Hey, where was Sarah's trial? Here, right there. Hi, excited to be here. Sarah's first step trial was right here. Hi, I'm Chantei. I'm Steve. Excited to be here. Come with us on Sarah's journey. How one girl put segregation on trial. The first step. By Susan Goodman, illustrated by E.B. Lewis. Sarah Roberts was 4 years old when she started school in April 1847. Even though it was spring, icy winds still wailed off Boston Harbor near Sarah's home. She was lucky because her school was so close by. Sarah dashed past the hay sellers and carpenters, the organ makers, and oystermen. After crossing Causeway Street, she was just steps from the Otis School. The Otis was one of Boston's best, with more books than most kids had ever seen. This is a picture of the first page. Sarah practiced her sums and letters. She memorized poems. She spent recess in the play yard with her classmates. This is a picture of Sarah in school. Then, one day, a policeman walked into Sarah's classroom. He took her out of her school and said she could never come back. Ever. The Otis School was only for white children. Sarah must have been surprised and frightened when she was forced out onto the sidewalk. But Boston had a rule that said African American children must go to a separate school just for them. Sarah's parents hated this unfair decree and had enrolled her in the Otis anyway. Once the people in charge of city schools realized what had happened, they threw Sarah out. Her parents weren't surprised or frightened. They were angry. Adeline and Benjamin Roberts tried to imagine Sarah's walk to the Smith School. Which was for African American children. She would have to zigzag through many streets, crossing one neighborhood after another. Sarah would have to go all that way for a school that never taught subjects like history or drawing. All that way for Boston's only school without a play yard. A school that owned only one book. Every day, Sarah would pass 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 schools she could not enter. Sarah's father had taken this trip when he was a boy. He knew exactly how it felt to look up at all those windows filled with white children. And how it felt when the children looked down at him. No child should ever feel that way again. Certainly not his Sarah. Her parents stepped up to fight for change. Sarah's grandfather was a soldier in the Revolutionary War. Fighting to free Americans from unfair laws. Sarah needed a different kind of warrior this time. One whose battlefield was a courtroom. A lawyer fighting to convince judges that this rule must be changed. Robert Morris was the second African American lawyer in the entire United States. Sarah's parents picked him to be her champion. He was new at his job. In fact, he had taken only one case to court before, but he won. It took Morris more than 2 years to get Sarah's case to the most powerful court in Massachusetts. He knew it was her only chance of winning. As Sarah's trial grew near, Robert Morris asked another lawyer to join him. Charles Sumner despised the way his country treated African Americans. What's more, he had a special gift. He was a great speaker. When Sumner talked about justice, he could touch people's hearts. On December 4th, 1849, a heavy snow blanketed the city. Even a ferocious blizzard wouldn't have stopped people from flooding into the courthouse. So many of them were African American, dock workers and washerwomen, barbers, and blacksmiths. Giving up a day's pay to be there. Some were lucky enough to get a seat. Others were willing to stand for hours if need be. Sarah's story was their story too. Her case seemed to be changing things already. It was the first case asking our legal system to outlaw separate schools. It was the first case. It was the first time an African American lawyer argued before a Supreme Court. It was also the first time an African American lawyer and a white lawyer teamed up to fight for justice. 3 important steps forward. Sarah and her family sat in front, dressed in their finest. Spectators buzzed all around them until the judges filled in and were seated. Robert Morris had been Sarah's voice from the beginning. He spoke first here, too. He presented the facts of her case, including the 2 most important. Boston's rule said students should go to schools nearest their home. Yet, Sarah's skin color meant she must cross the city to reach her school. In a grown-up chair, her legs were too short to reach the floor. Anyone looking at Sarah could imagine how long that journey would feel. Charles Sumner's long speech lay on the table. But he barely looked at it as he spoke. All men are created equal, says the Declaration of Independence, Sumner stated. All men are born free and equal, says the Massachusetts Bill of Rights. Education in Boston is brought to every white man's door, but it is not brought to every black man's door. He is obligated to go for it, to travel for it, to walk for it, often a great distance. Even worse, Sumner said, African American children are forced into a school for themselves alone. Any school that sets a race apart cannot be as good as one where all children come together as equals. Equals as promised by Massachusetts law. Sumner's clear voice rang through the courtroom. This little child asks at your hands her personal rights. Everyone knew that if Sarah got her rights, so would every other African American child in Boston. After 4 long months, the judges announced their decision. All that work, all that hope, and Sarah had lost. It was a giant step backward. So many people felt angry and hopeless and helpless because the judgment was final for the time being. Every big change has to start somewhere. Sarah's father crossed the state asking people to sign petitions. That said, all children, no matter the color of their skin, should be able to attend their neighborhood schools. Sarah's story inspired other African Americans to push for their rights. People passed around copies of Charles Sumner's speech. They started using an important new phrase, equity before the law. More petitions went out. more names flooded in. When all these demands were delivered to the State House, politicians began talking too. Sarah's case had lost in court, but her cause was won when people, black and white, stood together and said, "No more. Now, right now, it is time for change." In 1855, Boston stepped into the history books as the first major American city to officially integrate its schools. Over time, other cities followed Boston's example. Not all of them, though. They didn't have to. Back then, every state could make its own laws about this issue. The march toward justice is a long, twisting journey. 3 steps forward, 1 step back. 1 step forward, 3 back. Laws change and the march moves forward. People resist change, and the march slows to a standstill, waiting for a better time. Then, at last, ideas have changed enough, and people have changed enough. Finally, the march cannot be stopped. In 1950, about 100 years after Sarah's legal defeat, another girl and her family said, "No more." 8-year-old Linda Brown had to cross a dangerous train yard in Topeka, Kansas. Walk 6 blocks to a bus stop, then ride all the way to her elementary school. A better school, named, oddly enough, after Charles Sumner, was a mere 7 blocks from her home. It was for white children only. This time, however, the Brown family was one of 200 families from several states who joined together to stop segregation in schools for the whole country. They were organized by a group called the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. All these people worked together, joining the spirit of everyone who had fought for this cause in the past century. This time, the case was heard by the country's most powerful court, the Supreme Court of the United States. On May 17, 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court announced its decision. All 9 judges agreed with Charles Sumner. Separating children because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely to ever be undone. Separate schools can never be equal, declared the judges. They must be outlawed in every state of the land. It is so ordered. When the gavel slammed down to end court that day, it announced change all over the country. And in its echo, you could hear the sound of Sarah's first steps to school. And her long road to justice.